welcome to Macros with Mythili, our weekly program where we take a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in the country and overseas. During the past few days, developments in Greece and more recently China have overshadowed everything in the macroeconomic space, including the fact that in the last week of June, the government finally announced the criteria for selection of smart cities. But if truth be told, smart cities are far more likely to affect our lives and our economy than anything that happens in Greece or China. Remember, cities generate a disproportionate amount of economic activity, and as the Indian economy grows and urbanizes, the contribution from our cities too is bound to increase. Already with just 31% of the population living in urban areas, the contribution to GDP is over 60% and is expected to increase to 75% during the next 15 years. But given the urban chaos that most of us living in cities witness every day of our lives, the question is, are our cities really ready to meet this challenge? Can we make our cities smarter so that they can manage the accompanying complexity, become more efficient, add to economic prosperity, and most important, improve the quality of life? What are the challenges? Are smart cities just wishful thinking, given where we are today? Can they transform the economy? And who better to answer those questions than Isher Ahluwalia, noted economist and chairperson, Board of Governors of the Delhi-based think tank ICRIER, who's done extensive work on urbanization, Vinayak Chatterjee, chairman and MD, Feedback Infrastructure Services Private Limited, who has kept a close watch on developments in the infrastructure arena, and Pratap, Padode, President, Smart Cities Council, India. Welcome to the show. Isher, cities are everywhere described as being the engines of economic growth. But is it that the economic growth leads to the development of cities, smart or unsmart? Or is it that smart cities lead to economic growth? Which way does the causation lie?
Mythili, just as in the 1960s and 1970s, Green Revolution was the engine of growth, there's no question that today, in India's current stage of development, cities are the engines of growth. And we need a planned strategy for urbanization, not only for the urban sector, but also for proper development of the rural sector.
Pratap, there are so many different definitions of smart cities, but if you were to single out the 2 or 3 most significant aspects of smart cities, what would you like to put them as?
See, just to add to what the question that you raised earlier with Isher about how the smartness can alter the economics. I mean, there's a clear example if you look at the taxi services which are already there, traditional, and then you've brought in the Uber and the Ola cab services, which are a smarter solution to mobility. Now, we've seen that not only that 150,000 people have got more employment due to these new services, but also the earning capacity, which used to be 7,000 to 10,000 rupees a month, has jumped to over 30,000 to 40,000 rupees a month. So there is an element of the smart solutions which is actually accelerating the process of economic growth. And therefore, coming to your question, that whether I think what I see is there is a whole lot of confusion going on about the facilities that a basic city is supposed to offer. And sometimes people think that now a smart city is going to offer those basic, elements which a basic city should have offered in any case. So if we shouldn't confuse the two. I would say that once a basic city with all its basic needs is there, and then you add on smart solutions which enhance the utilization of the resources for that city to make it more livable, more workable, and more sustainable, then you are talking about moving towards a smart city.
Vinayak, Pratap talked about building on cities after they've got the basic infrastructure. So that is what my question is, because he also spoke about Uber and Ola. But what we've seen with that is that though we've got these smart taxi services, we've seen that there isn't the accompanying law and order. So we've had a whole lot of cases of taxi drivers not acting properly with their lady passengers, etc. So are we really trying to run before we can walk? Do we need to get basic infrastructure services in place first and then talk of making them smart, or can they go hand in hand, Vinayak?
Tough question, but my whole issue with smart cities is that you ask 100 people today in India, well-educated, fully aware people of what is a smart city, and you will get 100 different answers, because while we all talk about smart cities, none of us, including the government, have actually converged on a universal acceptable definition of what a smart city is. And until we define what a smart city is, then how can we plan a journey that takes us there? So in a sense, to set the stage, I am offering you 10 reasons which I think, having spoken to a lot of experts and my own studies on urban rejuvenation, I think there is a 10-point criteria that would broadly be acceptable as a definition of a smart city, and I'll take the next few seconds to read them out to you. First, it should be information, communication and technology enabled governance. I think there is no question on that. So, number 2, it should have efficient utilities, energy, water, solid waste and effluent management, efficient, modern in the sense that we all understand it. 3, it should have meaningful public-private partnerships, because that obviously now is supposed to be the main vehicle for raising resources. 4th, it should have safety and security and the kind of issues you just mentioned a little while ago. 5th, it should have financial sustainability. It should be able to run on its own revenues and collections. 6th, it should have a citizen participative local government. 7th, it should have sufficient social capital, by which I mean open spaces, parks, green areas, children playgrounds, schools, hospitals, etc. It should not just be an industrial park, it should have sufficient social capital. Number 8, it should have transit-oriented habitats, which means a transportation network, including fanciful ideas of walk to work and stuff like that. Going beyond that, it should have a master plan that is transit-oriented. Number 9, it should have green features in today's world, so that the carbon footprint is minimized. And finally, it should have a minimum population criteria, so that any small gated enclave tomorrow or even a Bandra Kurla complex or a gift city or something, we don't call as smart cities, because they're really enclaves. So we need a minimum population criteria. So I am offering this 10-point definition saying, if this is accepted, I mean, I'm sure people would like to either add or subtract. I'm not sure anybody would like to subtract, but people may want to add. Once we have an universal definition of smart city, then we can say that if we do these following things for city X, Y or Z, then in 10, 15 or 20 years time, that city has earned the right to call itself a smart city. Because today, nobody knows who's going to come up and say I'm smart in the next 7, 10 years and on what basis. But let me stop here.
Okay, that's a long, long list. Isher, Vinayak gave a list which sounded almost utopian. Now, you've done so much work on the urban centers in India. How far are we from any of these features, not just 10 of them, but even any one of them? How far are we in reality?
Mythili, let me first give you a 2-sentence definition of a smart city and not a 10-point definition. My definition of a smart city is a city in which citizens demand good governance, and the government, with the help of good administration and management and use of new technology, delivers services in a transparent, accountable and sustainable manner. Sustainable meaning both financially and environmentally sustainable. This requires not just smart technology, but it requires smart people who demand good governance and smart institutions who can actually convert infrastructure into service delivery. We are very, very far from this point, but I have to compliment this government on focusing on the urban agenda. The fact that they have said that urban development is important and it's crucial even for rural-urban synergy is something which I think is very, very welcome. However, I am much more excited by the Swachh Bharat campaign than I am. I don't think most of India is ready for smart cities, but I am sure there are some cities that are ready to go smart today. And since we are a large and diverse country, I have no problem with those cities that are ready to go for smartness. However, there are some preconditions of both Swachh Bharat or Amrut or smart cities. And that is that we need to make our urban local governments empowered. Today, they are not empowered both financially and in autonomy even to charge for the services that they deliver. They don't have finances that can take care of even paying salaries to their people who work there. In that sort of context, there is a lot of homework that has to be done to make our federal system work in a way where there is financial devolution, there is empowerment, so that urban local governments can be counted on to deliver and be accountable.
Oh, absolutely. I think, Vinayak, you gave a long list which would have daunted most people. And Isher has put a finger on it when she says it is urban local bodies. Unless we empower them, there's nothing that we can do to make our cities smart. But I'm afraid on that note, we have to slip into a very short break. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the government's smart city idea. Is it a smart idea or not, in the light of the recent criteria which the government has made public? Isher, before the break, you were talking about the need to empower urban local bodies. And that's very important because urban local bodies are required to bring up matching resources. Now, is it remotely possible for the urban local bodies to bring out these kind of resources? And is that not something that is in the state government's domain?
Well, it is in the state government's domain, but one very important opportunity that is coming up is that of the goods and services tax, Mythili. If when the GST amendment is passed, if they agree, that is the state governments and the government of India agree to devolve a small percentage of GST to urban local governments, then they will have guaranteed and predictable transfers which will give them that oxygen to get going. Then of course they have to find new ways of unlocking land value as they invest in infrastructure, and they can charge the user charge to cover the cost. Right now, the policy, the institutional framework is such that the state government has to approve an increase in user charge. If the urban local governments could be given the autonomy to have the ability to increase rates if the costs increase, then they could actually be financially empowered. And then of course they have to be institutionally empowered, because there is very little capacity. Actually, there is very little capacity at the local government level, at the state government level and Government of India level to plan and manage cities, because this is a new area. And our experience of JNNURM shows us that in 5 or 6 states, where the states had the capacity and they were willing to hold hands of their urban local governments, where the urban local bodies were financially relatively less weak, they were able to achieve a lot with JNNURM funds. But in other places where capacity was lacking, where the state did not provide the enabling environment, these funds were not enough to be translated into better services and better quality of life. So I think it is very important to empower the urban local bodies, both financially, institutionally and through building capacity.
Absolutely, it's very important to empower local bodies, but look at the kind of money that the government has set aside, Vinayak, just 100 crores per year. Now, what is the kind of money that one really requires if one were to achieve all that you said, that 10, that long list that you have, 10 features that you wanted in a smart city? What is the kind of money that you would require for any one city? Just give me a ballpark number.
My ballpark figure is something that I have written in my Business Standard article already about smart cities needing smart implementation. The ballpark figure, depending on the size of the city, could be anything from 15 to 50,000 rupees, 50,000 crore rupees. So let's put things in perspective. I think on Isher's point, I fully agree with her that the key to unlocking the door is empowerment of local self-government. But I consider that a necessary condition and not a sufficient condition, for the simple reason that mere empowerment does not lead to results. After all, we've had a CPM government in Bengal fully empowered for 32 years. And do you think it's led to striking development? No. So empowerment itself doesn't lead to the necessary results. And therefore, a certain hard criteria of when a city can call itself smart is still required. Coming to your question now, finances, I think it's very clear that what the central government is spending is just what one would call seed, not even seed capital. It is more like preparing, it's more like putting fertilizer, a little fertilizer on the ground, because 100 crores per city for 5 years is not going to transform the city into a smart city. I think the central government itself knows that, and therefore in all the literature that it has put out and in all the conference speeches, it has said, while we are putting in the seed capital or angel capital or whatever you call it of 100 crores to get the intellectual juices flowing in terms of master planning, engineering, projectization, creating SPVs, etc. The balance money will have to come from state governments and, please note, from public-private partnerships, which means from corporate India. You're ultimately falling back on the resources of the state government and corporate India for PPPs. So let's get the PPP story starting, and let's recognize that 100 crores is just part of what to be appreciated. It is part of an awakening, is part of a competitive challenge, is part of the seed funding to create the intellectual capital that can then translate the vision into practice. And if you see it in that lens, then I would completely agree with Isher that I would like to give this government full marks for having put urban rejuvenation and urban transformation very, very squarely in the public imagination. So that once the public imagination is fired, you find that politicians, local, state and central, gearing up to deliver, and hopefully something will be delivered. But let's not take the financial devolution by the center with any great degree of importance, other than just for maybe providing the necessary, shall we say, spirit to get going.
Pratap, Vinayak spoke about how the government is firing the public imagination, but Isher also talked about user charges, and I'm not really sure that the public is really willing to pay the user charges. Yes, they want all the smartness in smart cities, but time and again we found that the public is not willing to pay, whether it is for tolls or whether it's power tariffs. So how are other cities got over this?
See, I think it's a misnomer that people don't want to pay for user charges. I think the reason people don't pay or protest against user charges is because either the quality is not consistent or the service is not consistent. Something in terms of the supply is not to the expectation of the consumer. Otherwise, I have seen case studies where people are paying 50 paisa per liter of water in small areas which are supplying to 10,000 people, and they're willing to pay as long as the water supply is consistent, the quality is good. So I think this is a political kind of a play that people do to bring out some sort of a protest or score some brownie points with the electorate. But otherwise, people would rather pay and get consistent service and quality service than not have the service at all, which is the other outcome when you say that, okay, they will not pay, you have to give them free, otherwise they're not ready to pay, and then the service doesn't come across. But I think what we need to see is also, I would also connect it with the previous point which Vinayak was making, that municipal authorities, they are, despite having full budgets, like maybe Maharashtra has around 30,000 crores, and they are barely able to spend 70 to 80% of the budget, and 20% of the budget just sort of is they are unable because they don't have capacity to be able to conceptualize, create projects which have this kind of a sustainable model where you do. You provide a certain service, you get certain user charges in place, and the cycle is sustainable and moves on. Then there are political influences, etc. And finally, the projects actually do not move forward. They just keep moving from one period of time to another. So I think the correction really is needed in terms of the capacity building there. And now, of course, the new guidelines already prescribe that there will be an SPV, and there will be a CEO of an SPV with a 3-year term. So actually that part where we have, the state has not really provided a good empowerment to the municipal or the ULB chief will get taken care of to some extent here. Of course, there has to be political will as well. But in this current guideline system, there is provision of the money that in the SPV that needs to be provided for. And unless and until, again, coming back to what Vinayak said, the kind of money that we are putting in, which is 100 crores, is absolutely not going to be sufficient at all. I mean, you require nearly 35,000 crore per year. But then we are talking about, it depends on what context. Is it a greenfield? Because in the current guidelines, you've got retrofitting, you've got redevelopment, and then you've got greenfield. So in retrofitting, when you've got a 50-acre plot, you can generate something like this because it's important to win the credibility of the people who are going to be served in a smart city, because people today just disbelieve that there is anything like this going to come about. So you got to do it in small pockets, win their credibility, and then move on to the next level, and then grow that.
Well, I'm afraid I'll have to interrupt you there, Pratap, because it's time for us to slip into a very short break. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the government's smart city idea in the context of the recent guidelines that have just been released by the government. Isher, if you've just seen those guidelines that the government released in the last week of June, there seems to be a very heavy bias for the cities which are already well administered. So does that in fact further skew the selection? This is, mind you, just the first stage. In the first stage, it's left to the state governments, and there's this list of criteria which seems to suggest that those cities which are already doing well, they are likely to be favoured. So does this mean, carrying coals to Newcastle, as it were?
No, Mythili, I would first like to comment on what had just gone on before the break on, a lot of faith is being put in public-private partnership. Now, there was a time when we used to say that when a private sector company goes sick, you nationalize it and everything will be solved. Then we came to a stage when we would say public sector is doing very badly, privatization, and everything would be okay. Now for the last 5-10 years, we've been hearing public-private partnership is the solution. And believe me, I have looked at the public-private partnerships in the urban sector, and what I find that we need to create is a basic trust between the public sector and private sector, which is missing. We need to create an assured revenue model. Only then will public-private partnership bring any money to the table. Otherwise, the money comes from the public sector and private sector comes in to manage, and that is not what we understand by public-private partnership, which will be needed for smart cities. Third, there has to be a dispute resolution mechanism. My fear is that if we have this grand plan and we put all our faith in PPP, looking at how PPP has worked in the past 5 to 10 years, I think we may be in for a lot of challenges. So I am not trying to say we should not have PPP, but we need institutional reforms. And what is very odd is that in the Smart Cities program, we are just saying there be an SPV, and the municipal powers will be delegated to the SPV. Now, I think this is going to be politically challenged. You are saying there are democratically elected institutions who are accountable to people to deliver services, and to say that there is a technical solution of SPV is just not right. However, let me tell you, I agree with Pratap, what he says. Today, people are willing to pay. The problem is our politicians are not willing to charge. So, I think we need to create an environment in which good services are demanded and governments are made accountable, and we need to have a revenue model. Only then can PPP deliver all these ambitious goals, which I think are very good. Maybe not all cities are ready for it, but some cities must be used as pilots to show if we can make them smart. Now, I really believe that in order to be smart, you need to be clean and healthy. So, I am putting my faith much more on the Swachh Bharat campaign, and I hope that private sector would embrace that the governments will embrace that with as much enthusiasm as they are showing for smart cities. If we have clean cities, if we have public health conditions, yes, definitely we are ready to go for smartness.
Okay, Vinayak, we're almost running out of time, but if I were to ask you for a quick reaction to Isher, is Swachh Bharat really a precursor to smart cities? Would you agree with her on that?
Well, not necessarily. It certainly should run in parallel. And to respond to Isher, and she's made some very good points, my very quick point is that often the discussion and debate on smart cities is about financial and technical challenges. It is ultimately a political economy challenge. The politicians have to devolve power to local self-government, and at the local self-government level, the politician has to have the courage to stand up and say, pay for user charges for services that are delivering. And that's my moot point.
Well, I'm afraid we're completely out of time. The good news really is that all our experts are much more hopeful on the smart cities idea than I as a journalist am. Thank you so much Isher, Vinayak as well as Pratap for joining me in this wonderful discussion. Thank you also for watching, but we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.